Welcome to our latest online talk. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Alex Wolf again. We've just been talking about the past and decided that he's probably done 4 or 5 talks for us before, which is absolutely wonderful. I'm a great supporter of the museum. Alex is the professor of medieval studies at the University of St Andrews and has degrees in medieval history, medieval English, and archaeology from the University of Sheffield, um, and was awarded a doctorate by Portfolio in the subject of politics and identity in early medieval Scotland, which is very relevant to tonight. And he has published widely on topics ranging from Roman Britain to early medieval Scotland. No, sorry, to Icelandic literature. But perhaps he's best known for his book From Pictland to Alba, Scotland 789 to 1070. And he lives in the Howe of Fife, which is lovely, where I visited recently and can confirm that that's a very nice part of the world. In terms of his talk, starting from the well-known 7th century text, the Senchus Fer nAlban, which provides a military census of the kingdom of Dál Riata and provides some unique demographic and logistical information, his paper will move out to look at comparable, though less complete material from elsewhere in Britain and Ireland and ask whether such material is a useful guide to population numbers and to social and political organisation. And that's what we're looking forward to tonight. So without further ado, I will hand over to Alex.
Thanks very much. I will now attempt to share my screen.
Are
we there?
We're there. You just need to yeah, we're absolutely there now. Yes, perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Alistair. And it does always give me great pleasure to come, both metaphorically or virtually, and really up to Grove House. If any of the people watching have never been to Easter Ross and to Rosemarkie, it is an amazingly beautiful part of the country, absolutely packed with historical and archaeological material. So I definitely recommend an in-person visit if you've never been. Anyway, so today I'm going to talk about ships, men and land in Dál Riata, England and beyond. And it's kind of speculative in a way. I think this is probably the beginning of a bigger project that I'm not quite sure where it's going. But the starting point, as Alistair said, is this text, which we traditionally have called the Senchus Fer nAlban, although David Dunville persuaded us that the correct title is the Miniugath Senchus Fer nAlban, which is much harder to say, which might be why he prefers it, or preferred it. He sadly died recently. And what the title of this text means, an explanation of the history of the men of Britain. And it's very easily accessible in John Bannerman's edition in Studies in the History of Dál Riata. And for a very long time, we were heavily reliant on Bannerman's for almost everything we knew about it. He wrote a series of articles in the 1960s that were then republished in slightly modified form in a monograph in 1974. And then David Dunville, who I just mentioned, the late David Dunville, published a paper in 2002 where he basically supported most of Bannerman's work, but pointed out some nuance and the way we should understand the text. And these are really the two only major discussions of this text that are currently available. It gets used a great deal by historians of Dál Riata, which, for those who don't know, is the first Gaelic-speaking kingdom in Scotland. It actually stretched across the narrow seas, including parts of the far north of Antrim, around Bushmills, where the whiskey comes from, but is basically mostly coterminous with modern Argyll. You sometimes see the spelling as Bannerman has it there in the more anglicised form, Dál Riata or Dál Riata, but there's been a tendency to go back to Dál Riata in the last sort of 30 or 40 years. So a little over half of this text of the Miniugath is made up of genealogical material. It basically talks about the descendants of a man called Jocheth Munrebar, from whom a great many families in Argyll and the northern part of Ireland were descended, although it seems to have been edited, and this was one of Dunville's major contributions, was to point out that there were a very large number of descendants of Iorchith begin to be talked about, but then it cuts back to just those whose descendants ended up living in what's now Scotland. And his argument was that this was probably a relatively late editing, as was the title, that this text became interesting for its Scottish material, but may not have originally been intended as a solely Scottish text, but looked at this wider tribal grouping that included a lot of the north of Ireland as well. However, I'm not going to talk in much detail about this material, which is mostly just X son of Y, son of Z, going on ad nauseam with lots of very difficult to pronounce names. And there are things one can say that's more interesting about it, but perhaps not best in a live talk. That's best to be read over so you can recheck who's that person again with a text in front of you. So much of the detail of the census material, which is what's the second half of the text is made up of, seems to have been recorded for military purposes. And although it's been slightly garbled in transmission, there are some odd gaps and spelling mistakes and so on, it's fairly clear what the basic structure of it is. And a consistent statement made on at least 4 occasions in the text is that 2 warships of 7 benches each was due from every 20 houses in the territory of Dál Riata. And it divides Dál Riata into its 3 main sub-kingdoms, if you like, or small units, that of the Cenel Navran, that of the Cenel Neniasa, and that of the Cenel Loan. And Cenel just means kindred. So the kindred of Gavran, the kindred of Enius, that's the name that our name Angus comes from, and the Cenel of Lorn, which was a personal name, but is also the origin of Lorn, the area in North Argyll that is still called Lorn today. And it gives us the summary of how many houses there were and from which you can infer how many ships there were. So Cenel Navran, which was the group that supplied the kings or over-kings of Dál Riata, is assessed at 560 houses, thus 56 ships. Cenel Neniasa, 430 houses, thus 43 ships. And Cenel Loan, 420 houses, 42 ships. And the assumption behind this seems to be that a 7-bench ship would have about 15 people on board. So that's 7 people rowing on each side and somebody holding the steering oar at the back. So these are smaller than Viking ships, but still reasonably substantial. They probably were wooden ships. It's often sort of popularly felt that, or said that the ships of the Gallic world in the pre-Viking age were made of cowhides. Those sorts of ships were used, but probably not warships. And we have various illustrations of warships that make it fairly clear that they were wooden and built for speed. So the total fleet of Dál Riata would have been, or Dál Riata in Scotland anyway, would have been 141 ships. So that gives you a sense of its military size. And as I say, there are 2 warships and 7 benches from each 20 houses. If each bench has a rowing man each side, and if the boat also has a steersman, this makes a crew of 15 or 1.5 men from each house. And this, interestingly, is the same size as the ship Beowulf took to the land of the Danes in the beginning of the poem Beowulf, which holds 15 asum sund wudisochta. So 15 together sought the open sea. Why 2 ships from 20 houses and not 1 from 10, you might ask? And I think the only explanation could be either 20 houses formed some sort of an established unit of assessment, that it was the equivalent of a ville or a local district, or it was practical demography, meaning that a larger unit was more likely to produce the expected average capacity for crews, because of course you couldn't simply say 1.5 men from each house, because some houses may not have 1.5 adult men. In fact, very few are only going to have 1.5 adult men. So it's obviously the larger the group, the more likely your average is going to be able to produce the capacity that you're looking for. So that's probably what's going on there. So one of the questions is this data transferable? Would other ships and military levies have been similar? The Irish Chronicle, the Annals of Tigernach, notes under the year 729 the sinking of 150 Pictish ships at Ross Cuisine. We don't know where that is. If you look it up in the Onomasticon Goidelicum, it says a place in Scotland. But I think that's just the assumption on the basis of the fact they're Picts. But that would make this fleet roughly the same size as the fleet at Dál Riata. Can we infer that the fleet was drawn from a territory of 1,500 households? And if so, might we imagine that that's one Pictish kingdom, several Pictish kingdoms together? As I say, it's about the same size as the 3 canella of Dál Riata, very slightly larger. Another text that comes from more or less the same time period, from the late 7th century, is an Irish tract on status known as Crit Gavlach, which is the main text that's used in all the textbooks telling you about how Irish kingship worked and the different levels of Irish farmer and so on. And it tells us that the hosting or slúath of the ideal tuath, which is tuath is actually the Irish word for people, but modern historians use it to mean a kingdom. So the ideal kingdom had a hosting of about 700 men. Now, if in Ireland the military levy was also 1.5 men per household, can we infer that this idealized petty kingdom contained around 467 households, which is what you'd need to produce 700 men? It's extraordinarily close to the average assessment if you take the average for the 3 canella of Dál Riata, which comes to 470 houses. So it does look like they're operating on a very similar model of understanding how military levies operated. And it also allows us to see that the canella of Dál Riata probably are the equivalent of the polities that we call tuath in Ireland. So can this material help us to think beyond the early Gallic world? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, manuscripts D and E, under year 1008, says, Herbe bead sich hung, that man skelda over all Angel King shipu fastliche wirken, that is done of 300 shippen, and ti betunum anesketh und of 8 hidem helm and Bernam. Here the king ordered that men should, through the English nation, or throughout the English nation, steadfastly build ships, 1 ship from every 300, and a scaith from 10 hides, and from 8 hides a helm and a mail coat. So a scaith is a small warship. So the proportions here have puzzled people, that you have a large ship from 300 hides and a small one from 10 hides. But producing a small warship would seem to fit perfectly the situation we've been looking at in Dál Riata, a small warship from 10 hides. Because a hide is notionally a household. The word that's actually used in many of the Old English texts that we translate hide, it does actually have hidem here, but it comes from the word hew, which means a hearth. It's related ultimately to the German word for marriage, heirat, which means sharing a hearth together, making a home. So it means a small warship from every 10 houses. So that would be the same as the Dál Riatan assessment. The larger ships, because this, of course, is from 1008, 400 years later, towards the end of the Viking Age, is probably more like a Viking ship. And if it's manned on the basis of what's called the select fyrd, which was the late Anglo-Saxon military levy that asked for 1 person from every 5 households, then that will produce a crew of 60, which is about what we think many of these ships were had their capacity for. So you have a large ship of 60 made of more professional soldiers. The idea of taking only 1 from every 5 households rather than 1.5 from every household is because they're imagining going away for a fairly lengthy period of time, and they won't be able to pop home to milk the cattle or do whatever they have to do. So the difference is probably between local service and service away from the locality. So we can probably imagine that the Skaith, a small ship, is being used on rivers, estuaries, coastal waters for immediate defence, a bit like a Coast Guard vessel today, whereas the bigger ships, which come from much larger territories, are probably more for major military expeditions away from this, such as the expedition that Athelstan took to Caithness in 934, which would have required people to be away from home for a very long period of time. So the 300 hide ship soak, as this territory was called, is an interesting unit. Is it continuity from the past? In the late pre-conquest period in England, the 300 hide unit is best preserved in what's called the ship soak, and it mostly appears simply for the ship levy, although in the laws of Canute it's mentioned as a juridical area as well. So it's an area that such and such things must happen in each ship soak. But a 300 hide unit is also the basic building block of English polities as observed in the 7th century tribal hidage, which is the closest surviving document to the Senchus Fer nAlban from elsewhere in the insular world. So we look at that now. Now, tribal hidage is probably from the late 670s, although there's much debate about this, and some people will put it a bit later, but it's certainly sort of pre-Viking age. And though it only survives in late copies, and it lists 33 or 34 peoples from across southern and Midland England, together with the number of households or hides each possessed. Now, the reason I put 33 or 34 is because one group, the West Saxna, the Wessex, if you like, appears at the very end of the list and is given a rating of 100,000 hides, which is about the same as the rest put together. And it's likely that that was added at a very late stage in the editing and isn't original, because many of the smaller groups were probably actually component parts of the West Saxons, and probably people in the late 10th or 11th century who were editing this text, who were almost certainly living under a regime dominated by West Saxons, who at that point had conquered the rest of England, thought, oh, why aren't we here? And they hadn't recognized that they were already there. Anyway, it lists these peoples, and it starts with the Mercians, and it's usually thought to be a tribute list from the period when Mercia was dominant, which I say is a late 7th and 8th centuries. And most of the units break down into units of either 300 hides or an easy multiple, or something that you can see as a rounded up or down multiple of 300 hides. So 5 of them have 300 hides. They're mostly these very small places in the Fenland. 11 have 600 hides. 1 has 900. 3 have 1,200. 1 has 15,000. That's Kent. And 2 have 30,000, which are East Anglia and Mercia. And then 1 has 2,000, which looks to me like it's a rounding down of 2,100. 1 has 3,500. 1 has 4,000. 1 has 5,000, and 6 have 7,000. So those that are not divisible by 300 hides are within 100 hides of 300 hides. So I think this is evidence that they've just turned them into round numbers for the sake of accounting, and they probably are made up of a whole series of smaller 300 hide units. So that suggests that there's something fairly fundamental about a 300 hide unit that lies behind the way that England was organized, or the English were organized. And it's interesting this is happening across multiple kingdoms. And it's also interesting that the 2 biggest kingdoms are 30,000. So they are effectively 100 300 hide units, which looks like it's probably notional. It's probably just a way of saying really big in some way. So if we compare the English and the Gallic material, 466 or 470 houses per kennel or tuath, the Irish petty kingdoms fall in almost exactly midway between the smallest and second smallest units of tribal hidage, 300 and 600 hides, if we assume that the hides represent households, which is what they generally assume to represent. In fact, Bede just talks about the units of a single familia when he is referring to the things that are called hides in Old English. If we take these households as the equivalent, then Dál Riata as a whole would be very small by Southern English standards, little bigger than the Pexetna of the Peak District and half the size of the 3,000 hide subkingdom of Ashtun that Cenwalh gave to his kinsman in 648. So it'd be very small. Now, Paul McCotter has done this fantastic survey of Ireland, looking at all the evidence you have for territorial organisation, starting with the 12th century and working back and looking at earlier material. And he has produced a fairly definitive figure of 184 of these small kingdoms, the size of a Dál Riata and Kennela or of a tuath from the early period, from the Crith Gavlach. And if we take Crith Gavlach's notional 467 houses in each tuath, then we get a figure of 85,928 households for the whole of Ireland. Now, obviously, it's very unlikely that these are real figures. These kingdoms are not all going to be exactly the same size. Geography, history is going to mean they're slightly different. But we can probably imagine that this is what the intellectuals of the early Middle Ages imagined was the average size, in the same way that if you were talking about, I don't know, a Southern English county today, you could probably guesstimate roughly how big they are if you try to explain how big they were to someone from Central Africa, and you'd get a size that about half of them were quite close to, and a few others you just think, well, everyone knows Rutland's ridiculously small and Lincolnshire's ridiculously big. But you know, that kind of rule of thumb that we can all say, in much the same way as we might estimate the salaries of I don't know, university lecturers or something, you could guesstimate roughly what the average salary is. And that's how we should be thinking about these. But is 85,000 households, is that reasonable for Ireland? It compares with a total of 144,000 households for southern England. These are areas that are roughly the same size in terms of pure territoriality, but England does seem to have generally had a higher holding capacity for population because of better agricultural land than Ireland. So that's not implausible as a comparison. Of course, what this means in terms of population is very hard to know. Obviously, a kind of nuclear family, we might expect there to be perhaps somewhere between 5 and 10 people, but then many of these households may have owned enslaved people. And there's much debate amongst historians about how widespread slavery was. Some people, and I certainly used to be one of these, and I still might be, I'm uncertain, would say that most households probably were slave owning in the pre-Viking Age, and probably the Viking Age as well, in Britain and Ireland. But even if that's not the case, we should probably imagine a reasonable number are. So what should we guesstimate at? Maybe 10 people per household, which would then give us just under 1 million people living in Ireland. If I've done my maths right, 850 or 860,000. That seems not implausible, but it's very hard to be certain. And the bigger the unit, like Ireland or the whole of southern England, the easier it is to get it just about right. But obviously the variation, and we see this variation with those Dál Riata and Kennela, where they weren't all the same size, although their average of the three is almost identical to the notional size that Crith Gavlach has for an Irish kingdom. In fact, what the largest has 560 houses and the smallest 420. So variation can happen, does happen. And so thinking about how we could use this and what it tells us brings me to questions. And these are really my questions that I'd be very glad if anybody has any suggestions about this. How does one access, or how does one assess carrying capacity of the land? Can we look at a reasonable number of do sizes and structures of households make a difference? Might we assume an equivalence between Gallic small kingdoms and the 300, or maybe the 600 hide units of English records? Certainly by the 12th century, Irish single kingdom unit was often termed a tricaquet, or 30 hundreds. If the tricaquet were the Gallic equivalent of a 300 hide unit, it might imply that the ked, which was the equivalent of a 10 house unit, something that we've already seen in the Miniguth Senchus Fer. Is the difference between the 470 houses in the 7th century and the 300 in the Viking Age material significant? And if so, how so? So those are the kind of questions we need to ask. So the tricaquet, the 30 hundreds, notionally consisted of 30 bultia. So the bultia, this is the plural of the word ballia, which gives the Bal in Scottish place names, like Balnagowan or any number of place names in Scotland and Ireland, Bal or Bally in them. So these were units of taxation and military levy by the 11th and 12th century. And it's interesting that a surprising number of medieval Scottish territories comprise about 30 parishes. So, for example, the old territory of Kenalnavran, which is made up of Kintyre together with Cowell, Gia, Arran and Bute, has about 30 parishes, as indeed does the Diocese of Ross. It has 37, but 6 of them are on the west coast and probably weren't originally part of this cluster here. So that gives you 31 in Easter Ross and Cromarty, one of which is actually over here. So that gives you 30 if you're talking about what's actually in Easter Ross. So that seems an interesting correlation. The 12th century Irish text, Catha of Kelach and Cashel, the victories or the battles of Kelach and of Cashel, claims that each tricaquet supplied 10 ships, which would mean a ship from every 3 bultia. So again, bigger ships than we saw before. If we imagine that the 10 house units were still producing 15 people, that would be about 45 people to a ship, which again is not an unusual size for a small to medium sized warship of the Viking Age. So it's interesting how many of these units seem to be still there in the Scottish landscape. And I wonder whether many of our parishes, particularly our rural parishes, are in origin these bultia or cage, as they're called in the Irish text. So we might be seeing something that we could still see in the late Middle Ages. We can still see the relic of this kind of landscape organization. And this might help us doing the kind of work that Fiona, who's in the audience, has been doing, trying to reconstruct earlier kingdoms and units. I think you can make a very good case that Easter Ross was something very much the equivalent of the Canella at Dál Riata on the basis of this kind of calculation. So finally, we're left with kind of methodological issues, some of which I mentioned before. How does one assess carrying capacity of the land? Do sizes and structures of households make much difference to this? Or are they culturally very different? Or should we assume that certainly in the pre-Viking Age, society is pretty similar across the whole of the insular world, the whole of Britain and Ireland? Could Gallic military capacity be mirrored in English communities? In other words, if we had the material other than the tribal hidage for the age of Bede and so on, would it look very like what we see in Crithgavlach and Senchus Fer? And can we bring the Welsh or continental material into the equation? The Welsh material is temptingly very, very similar in many ways. it goes into a great deal more detail, but it's also much later in its surviving forms. It's I think all our manuscripts of Welsh law tracts date to the 13th century, and there's much debate about how old they really are. They claim to have been written in the 10th century, but many people, including Thomas Charles Edwards, who's probably one of the leading experts, thinks they may actually reflect a much earlier society. Certainly, they don't seem to describe the society that they were copied down in. There's almost no mention, well, there is no mention of Normans, no mention of Marcher barons living inside Wales in these texts. So they do seem to reflect a much earlier time period, but many people are very skeptical. So I've ended this slide with this reference to this article from a very long time ago by Thomas Charles Edwards from which was one of his first articles, I think possibly even before he finished his PhD, when he addresses some of these issues coming from a different angle. And he's much more interested in the question of how is it that the English and the Celtic material is so similar? And does it go back to some Indo-European past? I'm less inclined to go in that direction. I'm perhaps more willing to think that when you live in a particular kind of environment and you have a particular kind of technology, this is the kind of solution you come up with. And that there's also going to be a lot of comparison and looking over the fence into the neighbouring territory. So I think there's something going on here, but it's very hard to be certain exactly how similar everything is when the nature of the material is slightly different from all of the different parts of the world that we're looking at. But I think it's a starting point for how one can think about social organization, military organization, and households in early medieval Britain and Ireland, including Scotland. Thank you very much.
Need to unmute myself.
Can I unshare? Try to remember how to do that.
Yes, I'm sure you can unshare. Well, thank you very, very much indeed. That was very interesting, and yeah, we don't have anybody else's questions yet, so I'm really interested in understanding how this material can be applied in kind of other areas. So this is all derived ultimately from or initially from providing ships, but to what extent can we translate this to providing fighting men for land warfare?
My guess would be that the 1.5 men from every household would be from land warfare. The Crith Gavlach, the Irish text that talks about the 700 men from a Tuath, is probably mainly thinking about land warfare. Obviously, Dál Riata, it's all made up of islands and peninsulas. So
Yeah.
ships are, even if you want to have a land battle, you'd have to go there in a ship, probably. But also,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the questions I think is whether or not you had to have a coastline to have ships. It's interesting that English edict from 1008 applies to the whole of England. So every 300 hides in England had to produce a warship, and that would include places in the Cotswolds. You know, so now obviously these ships are not huge by modern or even late medieval standards. So as long as you could get them to a moderately sized river, so we could imagine rivers like the Tay or the Ness in Scotland, or like certainly the Severn, the Thames, the Nene in England. But some of them, you have to think they must have actually provided a ship that was being built somewhere else, not in their own territory. But those are interesting questions. I mean, if we're talking about 700 men from the smallest size of kingdom, I suppose what I could have done was work out what the entire military capacity of Ireland would be like. I don't know, maybe I could do that now. 700 times 184. But it's I think the other thing we have to think about is that probably important rulers, certainly kings, and maybe the next layer down, might well have had retained military as well, but probably not very large numbers. I
Right.
think Chris Gavlat suggests an Irish king in peacetime should have about 12 people in his bodyguard.
Right. Okay.
So,
Just
um,
really enough to protect him as an
yes.
individual kind of thing. Yeah. Fascinating. Mm.
Yeah, so the total military capacity for Ireland would supposedly be 128,800 people if you use that 700 from
Hmm.
each of 184 kingdoms.
Right.
So 100,000 people. But I mean, that's a bit implausible that that would ever have been mobilized because they weren't
Mm-hmm.
politically unified. But it does make you wonder about, that um, was that Pictish fleet, was that from about three kingdoms by our standards? Oh, I see Fiona's actually asking a question about this, so maybe we should go to that.
That was
Uh,
where I was going to go next as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was typing frantically there.
so Fiona, what were you saying?
It was about those 150 ships.
Yes.
And from what you're saying, that sounds like a huge chunk of the fighting force, if not the the Pictish
Oh.
fighting force that was lost.
Mm.
So it's
I mean,
just
we're only told the ships were wrecked, aren't we? I mean, I'm not sure. Can't remember. I mean, some of the people might have survived, but it does seem it is massive. It is,
yeah.
and it is extraordinary, and it's one of the few shipwreck incidents that appears in the Irish Chronicles. So I suspect it was an amazing event. Whether or not it's exact, I mean, one thing I wonder is the round number makes me think maybe it's simply the fleet from three kingdoms, and therefore they that's notionally about 150. Does that
Yes,
make sense?
it is a suspiciously round number, and I
It's a
wonder
suspiciously round number. So I think if they think that this is the fleet from three territories, and they therefore think it'll be about 150, and so therefore you can think of all levels of exaggeration there. If what we could we could talk about the Spanish Armada was mostly wrecked, but in fact a lot of them weren't wrecked, or they came ashore and so on. But it can be presented as a complete total national disaster, which on one level it must have been. I mean, if it's a levy of 1.5 men from each household, that's going to be a very high proportion of the free adult males. So that's going to have all sorts of impact. Even if it's only half that number, that's going to have a big impact on agricultural capacity, child rearing, male role models, all the sorts of things that men are supposed to be for.
Yeah, it does sound like a disaster, and yet you never really hear of any impact from it. And there are battles going on at that time as well, which don't seem to be affected by.
Yeah, although you have to be very careful about saying the battles go, because we sometimes telescope time in the past.
Yeah.
So we often think that something that happened 30 years after something is similar, but people could have grown up by then. If everyone under 15 or 12 or something was not there, they could be fighting age within quite a short period of time. I mean, that's the other thing that I don't think we know. I don't think we know the minimum age for warfare. In England, there's some evidence, or among the English, there's some evidence that people joined military retinues aged 14, which seems to be a fairly common age for male majority. But to begin with, they may well have been sort of helping out, and so on, cadets, as it were. Whether they would have been part of the ship force. Again, you probably want people who really did know how to row and could keep it up for a bit. So you might not have had your beginners, your cadets might not have gone on major expeditions.
So going back to the loss, I mean, how did this? Do we know how this happened? How were the 150 ships lost?
No, sadly, that's all it says. It literally just says 150 ships were lost.
But this was in a battle.
No, it was in it was that they wrecked, I think.
Oh, right. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, it's a shipwreck.
Yeah. Oh boy. Quite a disaster. Yeah.
But again, maybe they were. I mean, one of the questions would be where was it for it to make it to the Irish Chronicles? It's quite likely to have been something that would have bothered the Irish.
Right.
So whether
Yes.
this was a fleet brought round to the west coast, and maybe the west
Mm-hmm.
coast was a bit more dangerous for Picts who weren't used to being
Mm-hmm.
there, um,
Mm.
or something like that. Those are the sorts of things one might think about. I mean, that's one of the problems that you always have with the Irish Chronicles, is that they're a bit like radar. They can see things, but the things have, if they're far away, they've got to be bigger things, and there's certain
Right.
places. So, for example, one of the things that I'm always struck by is the earliest reference to St Andrews in the Irish Chronicles
Mm-hmm.
is in 747, I think it is, which is the death of an abbot. And then St Andrews isn't mentioned again for 200 years. And
Right.
I suspect the reason is that the abbot in person was someone who had a particular link with wherever they were keeping the chronicle, in Iona or Armagh or somewhere. And
Right.
therefore, that made it, a little bit like these, plane crash in Chile, one
Mm.
Scot dies. That you might get in the National or the Scotsman, but presumably the whole load of Chileans, but nobody's going to worry about them, not in
Right.
Scotland anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I suspect that that's the kind of issue that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So have a question from another audience member. Would numbers in Dál Riata support the notion that there was more of a merger at the time of Kenneth MacAlpin rather than a takeover? Back to the thorny issue of.
Uh, I don't know. I mean, more. I don't know. I wrestle with this all the time. I think very few of us who worked in the period think that there was a single obvious military conquest. I think the
Mm,
usual assumption is that uh, everything was thrown into terrible chaos by Viking invasions, and that probably
mm,
the key event is the battle in Fortriu in 839,
mm-hmm,
when the Pictish king, his brother, and the king of Dál Riata were all killed by the Vikings.
mm-hmm,
And so we may well see uh, a slightly chaotic thing in which a Dál Riata leader comes to the fore at that time, assuming Kenneth MacAlpin was Dál Riata. His name isn't actually diagnostic, he could be Pictish, and all the
mm,
contemporary sources simply describe him as king of the Picts. They don't start calling the king something different until his grandson's time. So he and
right.
his brother and his sons are just kings of the Picts, but it's the same family. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
they just didn't know. I mean, after all, the Normans conquer England and are called kings of the English still. So you can't really read too much into that.
No.
But I think people have always been aware that the population capacity for Dál Riata must have been much smaller than Eastern Scotland. So a
Mm-hmm.
kind of swamping folk migration type takeover has never really been much of an option, I don't
Right.
think.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it's really, I mean, it's one of the thorniest questions in early Scottish history. Well, probably is the thorniest question in Scottish history, is what actually happened then. And we're all trying to be very ingenious about this, but I get more and more skeptical. I think the idea of Socratic wisdom, that the truly wise man knows he knows nothing. The more you know about Scottish history, the less you understand it. It's only
Yeah.
simple if you
Well,
don't really know.
your version of events there is kind of what I usually tell people. I always make much of the 839 battle, and the
Mm.
idea of a political kind of ascendancy from the
Yes,
Scot.
okay. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things I suggested in my book, which was probably
Mm.
partly because of when I was writing it and what was going on in the news, was that you might maybe, I don't know if you, it's not been used quite so much now, but in Eastern Congo, the country is destabilized because the losers from the Rwandan genocide, the Interahamwe militia, the Hutus who tried to kill all the Tutsi,
Mm.
just they fled into Eastern Congo and then provided a military force that sort of destabilizes things. And I wondered whether refugees from the island portion of Dál Riata might have done something similar. And because we do
Mm-hmm.
know the Vikings captured large parts of Dál Riata and settled there, and a lot of the place names in places like Isla and so on were, and
Mm-hmm.
Kintyre and Norse. So maybe there was a big refugee problem, and then
Mm-hmm. Mm.
that contributed. But it's also the geography of Scotland probably changes as well. different areas become the politically dominant areas. So it's very complicated, but yeah, it's hard to see that it could possibly have been a sweeping conquest by Dál Riata.
Mm-hmm. And certainly not a genocide.
No, and I think probably one of the reasons why the name only changes gradually is that it was probably a gradual change. People didn't really realise that people thought it was maybe just a foreign royal family and didn't think that it was going to have major effects. And it may be, and this was an idea that I used to be quite sceptical about, but I think that Thomas Clancy's idea that the fact that ecclesiastically it was very heavily tied into Ireland, the population of Scotland generally, particularly once the Norse take it over, and we're talking about the area north of the Forth, south of the Forth, don't speak English. So we're talking about the kingdom of the Picts or the later kingdom of Alba. It's really small, and if they're constantly in cultural interaction with Ireland, they're just going to get kind of swamped. They're almost like a linguistic minority in the way that Scottish Gaelic speakers are in modern Scotland. And because those who want to go on to higher education go to somewhere where they have to speak Irish, and those who and the kings looking for princesses to marry will marry Irish princesses, and so there's just over maybe multiple generations, there's just a growing tendency that posh people have to speak Irish. Even relatively middle-ranking people start learning Irish. Irish and Pictish are not so different, but it's relatively easy. It will be like English and Dutch rather than English and Chinese, say.
Right.
So, yeah, it's. But I think we don't really know, and it would be foolish to try and come up with that.
We're getting way off your original topic here, but do you think that in the context of all this discussion, do you think that the fact that well, I'm assuming fact that Gaelic was kind of the native language of Iona, and therefore the Columban Church kind of thing, had any part to play in the disappearance of Pictish?
I think it might have had some part. I think that's probably why Pictish churchmen and churchmen from eastern Scotland went to train in probably initially Iona and subsequently in Ireland. We know, for example, in the life of Fintan, who's an Irish man who's captured by Vikings and escapes in Orkney, he eventually, when he escapes, he finds his way to the local bishop, who's able to speak to him in his own language because he'd trained in Ireland.
Right.
And similarly, we're told St. Cadro in the 10th century was said to have gone to Armagh to train, although he's originally from Perthshire. And there are various other people of that sort who are mentioned. And there's an interesting, as late as the 13th century, or late 12th century rather, the High King of Ireland, the last High King before the English invade, Rory O'Connor, leaves money to Armagh for the training of the churchmen of Eriu and Alba of Ireland and Scotland.
Right.
So I think Scotland it's seen as a sort of adjunct to Ireland in many ways in this period, and Ireland is where they went to. And I suppose it's in a way it's probably similar in broad terms, if not in detail, to the way that in subsequent generations, Scotland reorients itself to be part of the English-speaking world. And so, the disappearance of Gaelic and the replacement by Scots predated the Union. Right. It was just because Scotland's a small place, particularly northeastern Scotland, and it's just so easily swamped by bigger, more culturally dynamic neighbours.
I've never investigated this, but I mean, as far as we know, Pictish was never written down.
Well, certainly not survived. It's hard to believe it wasn't written down. I mean, what was her name? Kathleen Hughes pointed out that most of our manuscripts that contain early medieval Irish and Welsh texts, even if they're earlier medieval sources, are actually from the later Middle Ages. So, for example, one of the three manuscripts that has the Senchus Fer in it is from the 15th century. even
Right.
though we think their text is 7th century.
Mm.
And so her argument is that the reason there's no written Pictish is because any manuscripts that would have been written in Pictish, and there probably wouldn't have been very many, because generally speaking, before the late 8th, early 9th century, most people wrote in Latin for most of their serious texts. They could write in the vernacular. They probably wrote notes and things, and shopping lists and to-do lists and things in vernacular. But that even if there were Pictish sagas written, say, in the 9th century, which is when we think sort of the first Irish sagas and so on date to, and the earliest English stuff is probably from the 8th and 9th century, they wouldn't have been copied out after Pictish stopped being spoken.
Right.
And because, Beowulf probably dates to the late 7th, early 8th century, survives in a manuscript in the 11th century. Almost all our early Irish stuff survives in manuscripts of the 12th century or later. Our Welsh texts, the Mabinogi and so on, they're all from the 13th century or later. So it's about the fact that the people producing the big books that survived into the modern period couldn't speak Pictish. So when they were rummaging around in the library of St Andrews or Rosemarkie or Dunkeld or somewhere, they found this stuff that was unreadable and they just ignored it.
Threw it out.
Or scraped the stuff off. I mean, maybe if we x-rayed some later manuscripts from Scotland, we might see Pictish underneath. Or if we look for
that's a challenge.
The other possibility that I've often thought would be a useful or likely way of finding Pictish, you wouldn't find very much, is to look for what are called dry point glosses. This is where people, usually working with a Latin text, will, using their pen but without ink, scrape very faintly a translation for a difficult word. So they're reading Latin, they come to a word they have to look up or ask, and they'll write it above. So it's almost like the kind of imprint you see on the page below on a pad.
Right.
These are called dry point glosses, and they're now virtually invisible to the naked eye, but certain types of scanning can show them up. And I think that's probably, if we're ever going to find written Pictish on a manuscript, I think that's the most likely place to see it. If we looked at something like the St John's Gospel from Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, which has an eagle on it that looks like it's a Pictish eagle, then if we kind of x-rayed or ultraviolet scanned that, we might find the odd Pictish word or phrase written over a difficult bit of the Latin. But
fantastic.
Who knows?
What a research project. We need somebody to do it.
Yeah. I see there's a question about davocks here.
Yes, that's right.
From Sheila Curry. I had been thinking about that, Sheila, and I was looking at some of Alistair Ross's work recently. I need to get back to his PhD and look at it. I think there probably is some trying to work out where davocks fit into this kind of Russian doll of units. They seem to be smaller than Vulture. I know that, for example, Cromarty has, I think, 6 davocks in it. So that would mean, if we're imagining, okay, so here's a bit of the maths I didn't put in, which is that if you work out the number of, if you assume that the size of an Irish tuath is about 470 households, and it's made up of 30 Vulture, that should mean that each Vulture is roughly between 15 or 16 houses. So if a parish is roughly one of these Vulture or Kate units and has about 15 or 16 houses, if there's 6 of them in Cromarty, that's quite hard to do the maths for. It's 2 or 3, so maybe 15, maybe three perhaps a davock represents some sort of unit. I suppose one possibility might be that it represents something a bit like the Selectford from the late Anglo-Saxon period, where you had a smaller call up for long distance expeditions. So if you had one man from 3 houses, maybe the davock is the 3 house thing. But I need to look in much more detail about this to try and work out what you can really say. I've only looked at a few localities to try and work out So what I need to do is go through Alistair Ross's thesis and work out some average numbers of davocks in parishes and things to try and work out whether you can see how they fit into this model. Does that make any sense, Sheila?
Hopefully. Yeah, I think so.
Yes, it certainly does. I live in Cromarty, and I've been reading Alistair's book and trying to have a kind of long-term thing in my head where I'm wanting to look at old maps, old field boundaries, where parish churches are, and try and work out where the boundaries of these damn things might actually be, because the size will not be consistent. But
No.
it depends so much on what the productivity of in terms of
Exactly. And that would be something that'd be interesting. I mean, there's one of the things that I think Alistair gets wrong in his book is at one point, right at the beginning, he mentions what the first kind of English language scholar to discuss the Davok is Thomas Pennant, the Welsh landowner and polymath from the 18th century. And he says that it's, I can't remember now, so many Scots acres of arable plus a commensurate amount of grazing. And Alice says, what does that mean, a commensurate amount of grazing?
Yeah.
But I think the reason Pennant says that, and Pennant does know what he's talking about because he's a big estate owner in an upland area anyway, is that the amount of rough grazing is going to vary as a proportion of arable, depending on exactly, as you say, Sheila, what the landscape is like. So if you're in the Black Isle, it's going to be very different than if you're higher up the river system in Strathconan or somewhere. I think, trying to work out, I suppose the thing that you probably want to do, if you could find out, if you could get cadastral maps that actually showed you how much of the land in those areas was under cereal production in the pre-Second World War period, or ideally pre-First World War period, then you might be able to get a sense of what you're looking at, and then kind of basically ignore the non-arable, because that's good. I think the key thing is arable, and everything else is on top of that. And that's one of the reasons why you have these detached portions of davocks in the Highlands. It's so that people from densely populated arable areas can take their cattle for summer grazing, and basically they're sharing a bit of land from a davok where there's way too much rough grazing for the people who can be supported by the arable. So you've got your oatcakes are your basic standard of what the number of oatcakes you can make is the number of people you can have living on the land.
Yes. So because the interesting thing about the parish boundaries in the Black Isle is that all of them seem to include a bit of the Mulbui, the common grazing along the ridge, and a bit of the slopey bit down, and a bit of coast. So they've got, each of them seems to have a bit of all the relevant types of land and coast that they might.
Yeah. Well, here in the Howell Fife where I live, it's a bit like that, where they did reverse transhumance. The middle of the How used to be very boggy, and they would bring the cattle down there in the summer to graze, but it was too wet in the winter, so the cattle would be on the hill in the winter. But all of the parishes have a strip from hill down to what would have been the fen, what's now the big flat area.
Yeah. Yes, we just need to get on and get into it.
But I think if you could get hold of Alistair's PhD thesis, Sheila, I think he has more detail in there. I looked at it a long time ago and keep meaning to go back to it. It's an Aberdeen PhD thesis. I don't know whether it's online. But,
I don't know. I don't have the right library ticket, as you referred to at the start of this talk.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, but anyway, well, you might be able to get hold of a copy one way or another.
One way or another. Well, if there's anybody listening,
I can get you a copy, Sheila.
Oh, wonderful! Yeah, because I found his book really useful, and there's lots of tantalizing information that you can suck out. But yeah, the PhD may have some of the original stuff. Brilliant. Right, I'm going to mute myself.
Wow.
I do love that.
It's like we've stimulated a few further research opportunities. I really like the idea of trying to find these dry point glosses.
Yeah, well, I don't know. There may be people out there who know manuscripts better than me and say that it's bad, but people do find things. There's a researcher called what's her name? Mariah, can't remember her surname. She did a PhD at Cambridge a little while back, and she found some additional poems in the Black Book of Carmarthen, which is a very well studied manuscript. But there were some poems that hadn't been inked in. And she did it by using one of those ultraviolet things, the sort of thing that the police used to find blood,
Right.
Tried that. And there were illustrations as well. The scribe had obviously had quite a lot of fun that had not made it into the neat form of the book, but they are actually legible if you expose it to the right way. So my guess is that there probably is a little bit of Pictish. And one of the difficulties we have is that it's actually quite hard to identify where manuscripts come from within the insular world. In the later, from about the Viking Age onwards, the English adopt a very different handwriting style. But the handwriting style otherwise of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England before the Viking Age is all fairly similar. And you see these debates about whether the Book of Kells is from Iona or from Ireland, or some people even think it's from Port Mahomet now.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And it's not implausible. And I think there was a tendency for people to assume manuscripts were Irish or English. And that's why the term isn't used anymore. But in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, people often talked about Hiberno-Saxon style,
Right.
immediately making it impossible for anything to be written by the Welsh, for example, because the vast majority are, and they all look very similar. And so you see a manuscript and you look at the handwriting, you think, oh, that's Irish. They're most, if they're in Latin, you can't really be certain. But many of these things may have been pictured. One thing that's rather curious as well, that I've sometimes wondered about, is there is a piece of verse about Kenneth MacAlpin, in fact. It's a quatrain, I think it's just 4 lines, that's in an Irish kind of textbook about poetry from the Middle Ages, and it says it's a example of Pictish poetry.
Oh, right.
Now it looks like it's in Irish, but I've sometimes wondered if you could get someone like Gita Rees or someone to look at it, whether or not it's simply spelled phonetically in Irish, or whether it would work as Pictish. Because that's the other problem we have, is that what you see in the Irish chronicles is that they usually call the Picts by Irish sounding names. Now, because most of the names are very closely related, it's the same thing that we traditionally have done in English language historiography, where we talk about Peter the Great and Catherine the Great in Russia, whereas they weren't really called Peter and Catherine, they were called Piotr and Katarina. And we talk about French kings called John and Charles, and so on, or a Spanish king called Philip. They aren't called that, but because what they're called is close enough and etymologically the same, we just normalize it. And the Iona chroniclers could certainly do that for Pictish names. And so they might have been able to do that for some Pictish words and things as well. But I don't know, and I'm probably getting into dangerous water here. If a real linguist was listening, they'd probably be shuddering at this. But yes. I think going through all of the manuscripts, if it could be done systematically, I think there's a chance that some sort of Pictish will be found.
Unfortunately, Mr. Rees is not with us this evening.
No, and I see that
pick this up.
Jean Crayberg has asked me where was this potentially Pictish poem. I can't remember the precise manuscript, but there's a translation of it in Thomas Clancy's Triumph Tree. It's a poem to Kenneth MacAlpin, and Thomas Clancy will have a note telling us where it's from. It was edited by Kuno Meyer, I think, in a German edition in the early 20th century, but it's from presumably a 12th or 13th century book about poetry from Ireland, which has a whole series of poems in different styles and different forms of verse. And this one is described as Pictish. And some people think it just means it's using some style that's seen as Pictish.
Right.
Like we can have a hollandaise sauce. It doesn't mean it was cooked by a Dutchman. But So I don't have the reference off the top of my head because I wasn't expecting to be asked about British poetry.
Very
But
tantalizing.
if you look at Thomas Clancy's Triumph Tree, there will be all the information you need will be in there.
So another question here: what account has been taken of fuel supplies, e.g., charcoal, for these community units?
That's an interesting question. I mean, fuel. I think fuel would vary depending on where you were. So probably peat was being used by a lot of people, and wood. Of course, one of the things that pre-late modern societies were very good at was managing woodland, which we're very bad at. So things like coppicing and so on could produce renewable fuel. But that is an interesting thing to think about, that we often think about early medieval woods and forests as being the kind of wilderness, but it's actually part of the managed landscape. I grew up in Sussex, which is the most wooded county in England. It's in the southeast, but it's because the farmers manage woodland. There's no great forest tracts. It's not like the Great Caledonian Forest or even the Cairngorm National Park, but every farm will have a wood on it, or maybe two. And so there are hundreds of trees. And I think that they will have had woods of that sort where they could, or use peat probably.
Is Richard the questioner? Great. Well, I think we seem to have run out of questions, Alex. So I think it remains for me to thank you yet again, very sincerely, for your fascinating talk and equally fascinating discussion afterwards. We've roamed all over the place, but all very, very interesting. So yes, I think that's it, and we shall welcome you back as soon as you've got more to tell us about something.
Okay, well, I'll try and come up with something. Anyway, thank you very much for having me, Alistair, and the rest of you, and everyone at Grove House.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, and yeah, if this hybrid thing in October goes well, then we'll think about drawing you up here and doing something similar. Yeah, brilliant. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.